A dull country magistrate, it says here, the mayor of Windsor, from Boswelliana, we learn this, gave Johnson a long, tedious account of his exercising his criminal jurisdiction, the result of which was his having sentenced 4 convicts to transportation. Johnson, in an agony of impatience to get rid of such a companions, exclaimed, "I heartily wish, sir, that I were a 5th." Johnson was pregnant when Johnson was present when a tragedy was read in which there occurred this line, quote, "Who rules or freeman should himself be free." The company, having admired it much, "I cannot agree with you," said Johnson, and might as well be said, "Who drives fat oxen should himself be fat." He's got a point. He was pleased with the kindness of Mr. Cater, who was joined with him in Mr. Thrale's important trust, and thus describes him in a letter to Mrs. Thrale's, volume 2, page 284. Quote, "There is much good in his character, and much usefulness in his knowledge." He found a cordial solace at that gentleman's seat at Beckingham, in Kent, which is indeed one of the finest places at which I ever was a guest, and where I find more and more his hospitable welcome. Johnson seldom encouraged general censure of any profession, but he was willing to allow a due share of merit to the various departments necessary in civilized life. In a splenetic, sarcastical, or jocular frame, however, he would sometimes utter a pointed saying of that nature. One instance has been mentioned. See page 443. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to fall for that. Where he gave a sudden satirical stroke to the character of an attorney. The too indiscriminate admission to that employment, which requires both abilities and integrity, has given rise to injurious reflections, which are totally inapplicable to many very respectable men who exercise it with a reputation and honor. Exercise it with reputation and honor. Johnson, having argued for some time with a pertinacious gentleman, his opponent, who had talked in a very puzzling manner, happened to say, "I don't understand you, sir," upon which Johnson observed, "Sir, I have found you in an argument, but I am not obliged to find you in understanding." That's a good diss. Talking to me of Hoary Walpole, as Horace, late Earl of Osford, was often called, Johnson allowed that he got together a great many curious little things and told them in an elegant manner. Mr. Walpole thought Johnson a more amiable character after reading his letters to Mrs. Thrale, but never was one of the true admirers of that great man. We may suppose a prejudice conceived, if he ever heard Johnson's account to Sir George Stoughton, that when he made the speeches in Parliament for the Gentleman's Magazine, quote, "he always took care to put Sir Robert Walpole in the wrong and to say everything he could against the electorate of Hanover." You can see why you might not like him. The celebrated heroic epistle, in which Johnson is satirically introduced, has been ascribed both to Mr. Walpole and Mr. Mason. One day at Mr. Courtenay's, when a gentleman, possibly Boswell, expressed his opinion that there was more energy in that poem than could be expected from Mr. Walpole, Mr. Warden, the late laureate, observed, "It may have been written by Walpole and buckrammed by Mason." He disapproved of Lord Hailes. I'm guessing this is Johnson. It's a little unclear with the pronouns again. He disapproved of Lord Hailes for having modernized the language of the ever-memorable John Hailes of Eden, and in addition with which his lordship published of that writer's works. An author's language, sir, said he, is a characteristical part of his composition, and is also characteristical of the age in which he writes. Besides, sir, when the language is changed, we are not sure that the sense is the same. No, sir, I am sorry Lord Hales has done this. Here it may be observed that his frequent use of the expression, no, sir, I've noticed that myself, Boswell, yes, was not always to intimate contradiction, for he would say so when he was about to enforce an affirmative proposition which had not been denied, as in the instance last mentioned. I used to consider it as a kind of flag of defiance, as if he had said, any argument you may offer against this is not just. No, sir, it is not. It was like Falstaff's, I deny your major. Sir Joshua Reynolds, having said that he took the altitude of a man's taste by his stories and his wits, and of his understanding by the remarks which he repeated, being always sure that he must be a weak man who quotes common things with an emphasis as if they were oracles, Johnson agreed with him. And Sir Joshua, having also observed that the real character of a man was found out by his amusements, Johnson added, yes, sir, no man is a hypocrite in his pleasures. I have mentioned Johnson's general aversion to a pun. He once, however, endured one of mine. When we were talking of a numerous company in which he had distinguished himself highly, I said, sir, you were a cod surrounded by smelts. Is not this enough for you, at a time, too, when you were not fishing for a compliment? Johnson laughed at this with a complacent approbation. Old Mr. Sheraton observed, upon my mentioning it to him, he liked your compliment so well he was willing to take it with pun sauce. For my own part, I think no innocent species of wit or pleasantry should be suppressed, and that a good pun may be admitted among the smaller excellencies of lively conversation. Had Johnson treated at large the claris oratoribus of famous orators, he might have given us an admirable work. When the Duke of Bedford attacked the ministry as vehemently as he could for having taken upon them to extend the time for the importation of corn, Lord Chatham, in his first speech in the House of Lords, boldly avowed himself to be an adviser of that measure. My colleagues, said he, as I was confined by indisposition, did me the signal honor of coming to the bedside of a sick man to ask his opinion. But had they not thus condescended, I should have taken up my bed and walked, in order to have delivered that opinion at the council board. Mr. Langton, who was present, mentioned this to Johnson, who observed, now, sir, we see that he took these words as he found them, without considering that though the expression in Scripture, take up thy bed and walk, strictly suited the instance of the sick man restored to health and strength, who would of course be supposed to carry his bed with him, it could not be proper in the case of a man who was lying in a state of feebleness, and who certainly would not add to the difficulty of moving at all, that of carrying his bed. When I pointed out to him in the newspaper one of Mr. Grattan's animated and glowing speeches in favor of the freedom of Ireland, in which this expression occurred, I know not if accurately taken, we will preserve till there is not one link of the English chain left to clank upon the rags of the meanest beggar in Ireland. Nay, sir, said Johnson, don't you perceive that one link cannot clank? He's got a point. Mrs. Thrale has published, Anecdotes, page 43, as Johnson's a kind of parody of counterpart of a fine poetical passage in one of Mr. Burke's speeches on American taxation. It is vigorously but somewhat coarsely executed, and I am inclined to suppose is not quite correctly exhibited. I hope he did not use the words vile agents for the Americans in the House of Parliament. And if he did so in an extempore fusion, I wish the lady had not committed it to writing. Mr. Burke uniformly showed Johnson the greatest respect, and when Mr. Townshend, now Lord Sidney, at a period when he was conspicuous in opposition, threw out some reflection in Parliament upon the grant of a pension to a man of such political principles as Johnson, Mr. Burke, though then of the same party with Mr. Townshend, stood warmly forth in defense of his friend, to whom, he justly observed, the pension was granted solely on account of his eminent literary merit. I am well assured that Mr. Townshend's attack upon Johnson was the occasion of his hitching in a rhyme, for that in the original copy of Goldsmith's character of Mr. Burke, in his retaliation, another person's name stood in the couplet where Mr. Townshend is now introduced. Quote, though fraught with all learning, kept straining his throat to persuade Tommy Townsend to lend him a vote. It may be worth remarking, among the minutiae of my collection, that Johnson was once drawn to serve in the militia, the trained bands of the City of London, and that Mr. Rackstraw of the Museum's Fleet Street was his colonel. It may be believed he did not serve in person, but the idea, with all its circumstances, is certainly laughable. He, upon that occasion, provided himself with a musket and with a sword and belt, which I have seen hanging in his closet. And he was very constant to those whom he once employed, if they gave him no reason to be displeased. When somebody talked of being imposed on in the purchase of tea and sugar and such articles, that will not be the case, said Johnson, if you go to a stately shop, as I always do. In such a shop it is not worth their while to take a petty advantage. An author of most anxious and restless vanity, perhaps Richard Cumberland, being mentioned. Sir, said Johnson, there is not a young sapling upon Parnassus more severely blown about by every wind of criticism than that poor fellow. The difference, Johnson observed, between a well-bred and an ill-bred man is this. One immediately attracts your liking, the other your aversion. You love the one till you find reason to hate him. You hate the other till you find reason to love him. The wife of one of his acquaintances had fraudulently made a purse for herself out of her husband's fortune. Footnote here says this is Mrs. Cave. You can find that in Cook's Life of Johnson, page 47. Feeling a proper compunction in her last moments, she confessed how much she had secreted. But before she could tell where it was placed, she was seized with a convulsion fit and expired. Her husband said he was more hurt by her want of confidence in him than by the loss of his money. I told him, said Johnson, that he should console himself, for perhaps the money might be found, and he was sure that his wife was gone. A foppish physician, perhaps Sir Lucas Pepys, once reminded Johnson of his having been in company with him on a former occasion. I do not remember it, sir, Johnson said. The physician still insisted, adding that he that day wore so fine a coat that it must have attracted his notice. Sir, said Johnson, had you been dipped in Pactolus, I should not have noticed you. Johnson seemed to take a pleasure in speaking in his own style. For when he had carelessly missed it, he would repeat the thought translated into it. Talking of the comedy of the rehearsal, he said, "It has not wit enough to keep it sweet." This was easy. He therefore caught himself and pronounced a more rounded sentence. It has not vitality enough to preserve it from putrefaction. he censored a writer, Dr. John Moore, of entertaining travels for assuming a feigned character, saying, in a sense of the word, "He carries out one lie. We know not how many he brings back." At another time, talking of the same person, Johnson observed, "Sir, your assent to a man whom you have never known to falsify is a debt. But after you have known a man to falsify, your assent to him then is a favor." Though he had no taste for painting, Johnson admired much the manner in which Sir Joshua Reynolds treated of his art in his Discourses to the Royal Academy. He observed one day of a passage in them, "I think I might as well have said this myself." And once when Mr. Langton was sitting by him, he read one of them very eagerly and expressed himself thus: "Very well, Master Reynolds, very well indeed, but it will not be understood." When I observed to him that painting was so far inferior to poetry, that the story or even emblem which it communicates must be previously known, and mentioned as a natural and laughable instance of this, that a little Miss Jeanie Campbell, Mrs. Boswell's sister's stepdaughter, says in the footnote here, on seeing a picture of Justice with the scales, had exclaimed to me, "See, there's a woman selling sweetmeats." Johnson said, "Painting, sir, can illustrate, but cannot inform." No man was more ready to make an apology when he had censored unjustly than Johnson. When a proof sheet of one of his works was brought to him, he found fault with the mode in which a part of it was arranged, refused to read it, and in a passion desired that the compositor might be sent to him. There's a footnote here that says, "Compositor in the printing house means the person who adjusts the types in the order in which they are to stand for printing, and arranges what is called the form from which an impression is taken." The compositor was Mr. Manning, a decent, sensible man, who had composed about one half of his dictionary. When in Mr. Strahan's printing house, and a great part of his Lives of the Poets, when in that of Mr. Nichols, and who, in his 77th year, when in Mr. Baldwin's printing house, composed a part of the first edition of this work concerning him. By producing the manuscript, he had once satisfied Dr. Johnson that he was not to blame, upon which Johnson candidly and earnestly said to him, Mr. Compositor, and this is one of those things where now I won't be able to pronounce it right, because I got in my head about it. I ask your pardon. Oh, I got to say it again. Mr. Compositor, I ask your pardon again and again. Johnson's his generous humanity to the miserable was almost beyond example. The following instance is well tested. Coming home late one night, Johnson found a poor woman lying in the street, so much exhausted that she could not walk. He took her upon his back and carried her to his house, where he discovered that she was one of those wretched females who had fallen into the lowest state of vice, poverty, and disease. Instead of harshly upbraiding her, he had her taken care of with all tenderness for a long time, at considerable expense, till she was restored to health and endeavored to put her into a virtuous way of living. This circumstance, therefore, alluded to in Mr. Courtenay's poetical character of him, is strictly true. My informer was Mrs. Desmoulins, who lived many years in Dr. Johnson's house. Johnson thought Mr. Caleb Whiteford singularly happy in hitting on the signature of Papyrus Cursor to his ingenious and diverting cross-readings of the newspapers, it being a real name of an ancient Roman, and clearly expressive of the thing done in this lively conceit. He once in his life was known to have uttered what is called a bull. Sir Joshua Reynolds, when they were riding together in Devonshire, complained that he had a very bad horse, for that even when going downhill he moved slowly step by step. Aye, said Johnson, and when he goes uphill he stands still. Ooh. All right, that's enough for today. Till next time, ta-ta from Boswell land.